Since I met you, baby, all I know is that I want more. I really thought that I had seen it all. Had no premonition that I would slip and fall. But just when I think that loving you is gonna make me so tired, you turn around and tell me something so damn sweet, and it takes me just a little bit higher. I met you, baby, all I know is that I want more. Since you've been gone, all the minutes they seem like hours. Tick tock, tick tock, won't you come home soon? 'Cause when it comes time to see you, there's only one thing I wanna do. I say goodbye, pretty mama, I really can't believe that this is true.
Hi, this is Steph, and you're listening to WNHHLP 103.5 FM, broadcasting from New Haven, Connecticut.
Hello and welcome to Dateline New Haven's WNHH Radio. I'm your host, Paul Bass, inviting you to join me on an exploration of what makes the Elm City tick. Kellyanne Day helps make New Haven tick and stay warm. She runs New Reach, one of our bulwark agencies working to house the homeless. She's here in the WNHH studio to update us on the quest to wipe out homelessness. And thanks to Yale New Haven Hospital for providing support for today's program. And welcome back, Kellyanne. I love when you're in the studio.
Hi, Paul. Thank you. It's fun to be back.
So as we talked beforehand, you know, we've talked a lot, and you've been here to talk about this, how Connecticut's been wiping out chronic homelessness among the veterans, among just people, individuals, and now there's been a pivot among people like you and agencies like yours to work with a new population. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So what's been the pivot?
So the pivot is really towards families. There is a huge number of families, and many of them are hard to find. They're not as obviously homeless as some of the folks that we see on the street homeless or on the green. They're doubled up, or they're living in cars, or they've separated their children with family and friends. So it makes it a harder population to actually track and count. Although we have seen an increase in the number of unsheltered homeless families coming into the shelter system in Greater New Haven this past summer. And I think I've mentioned this before on the show that typically the summertime is a time where there's an influx of families into the homeless system, especially those that were doubled up. And once school's over, they have to go. It's a much more difficult
So this
situation.
is cyclical.
It is. And we've seen that, we're working now with some child care advocates as well, those of us who are providing emergency shelter for families, as well as affordable housing and rapid rehousing and supportive housing, which is our continuum of services to address this issue. But we're really looking at children who are at risk and moms that are at risk of these adverse childhood experiences. So if you've heard of the adverse childhood experiences, those families that have experienced 5 or more of those are at high risk of
Trauma,
homelessness and a whole host of other health issues and social issues.
So, Kellyanne, do we have an overall increase from year to year in homeless families in Connecticut and New Haven?
Again, as I said, Paul, it's hard to track. So actually, the numbers went down on the statewide level this year with the PIT count, which is the point in time count, went down about 6%.
And those are really those are tough numbers to.
They're tough. It's a one-day count. It's in the middle of the winter, and it's right after Christmas. And as I said, that's not typically a time where the families are. A high number of families are homeless. It's the summertime. The other issue is that we've closed emergency shelters. So we closed our Careways shelter last August. So that's 10 beds that are just right off the bat not counted.
And was that for where was that located? As in the Hill?
That's in the Hill neighborhood. Yeah.
And who was that for? Families?
That was for families. And it was a very difficult decision for our board and our staff to make. But as I tell people, we're stewards of public and private dollars. And so when we look at our programs, and if they're not financially feasible, we have no choice but to make some changes. Now,
so let's tell people what New Reach is. It used to, years ago, it was called Life Haven. When I began donating to it, I guess in the 80s or 90s, Mary Ellen
McGuire started Life Haven.
Yep.
Yes.
And that was in the old convent in Fairhaven.
That's right.
And you still have that building.
We still have that building. And now Life Haven and what was New Haven Home Recovery merged in 2013, and then to form New Reach. So we are more than a shelter. Some folks think of us as shelter only, but actually we are an organization that provides eviction prevention, diversion from shelter, rapid rehousing, affordable housing, and supportive housing. And those are that's the continuum of services, Paul, that families can work through to try to
how many shelters
become
do you
stabilized.
How many
We
beds?
have 2 shelters now.
And they're for families, right?
They're for families. Well, Martha's Place has 18 beds for single women.
Okay. And then when you talk about these other kind of programs, just so people know what the buzzwords are, supportive housing are facilities. It means facilities where you live in a place that also has therapists on job counselors, substance abuse counselors on hand, or case managers, so that you're getting social services help so that you can not become homeless again.
That's correct.
Do you have facilities like that, or you said you offer those services?
We do. We have a number of multifamilies throughout the city of New Haven, and we have some apartments in Hamden. We actually have 43 apartments in Hamden in 3 different buildings.
And how many in New Haven?
And in New Haven, we have about 17 split up between multifamily houses. And so we move folks out of shelter and into supportive housing who need that extra help.
Is the extra help on site when it's that small a building? Because I'm thinking of the one
It's not 24/7.
Because there's a 24/7 in Pendleton and Whaley where they got a lot of federal money, and there's also one on Sherman Parkway.
That's a different, that's still supportive housing, but it's just a different model. So with families, families who are living in a four family or a 3-family home, there's not going to be, a concierge or security on site.
But you have, let's say, case managers who go from place to place and check in with them every day.
Yep, on call 24/7. Actually, our house in Hamden, our apartments in Hamden, Geller Commons, who we named after Barbara Geller.
Yep,
if you remember Barbara, that has 24/7 and some program space on site because it's larger. It's 33 units, but supportive housing can really look different depending on how it's funded and how you set up the housing, and if it's for families or individuals and what the population is. So, for example, at Geller Commons, we actually have 7 youth who are aging out of foster care who are homeless, who are living there, who are really
define youth, like 18?
18 to 24 is what we define as youth, yes. So, we see, I'm just looking at the stats, there are definitely youth families as well. So we see women 18 to 24 coming into Life Haven who have children under the age of 6 that in many cases have never held a lease. And so are really going to need some support in stabilizing in the community. So for us, our mission is really about stabilizing families and trying to end that cycle of homelessness.
And that's a shift, too, over the years, right?
That's a shift.
Your agency and other homeless agencies have looked not just at getting people out the door
correct
when they need emergency shelter, but getting to a longer-term situation that deals with the roots of why they became homeless.
Exactly. Because when you've been doing this as long as I've been doing this, Paul, you start to see generational, recidivism. So you have women coming in who were there when they were children, and they're now coming in with their children. And, we live in a very expensive area. So, folks don't have livable wages if they are working. And many of our folks have had these adverse childhood experiences when they were children. So it puts them at a less opportunity for actually getting ahead economically. And then you layer on top of that the fact that we are a very expensive place to rent housing. So, and the vacancy rates are low. So it's like the perfect storm if you're a young mom who dropped out of high school because you were homeless yourself, and now you find yourself homeless with your child. But that's not to say that that situation cannot have a positive outcome. It can. It can. And we've seen it through programs such as our rapid rehousing program for folks who maybe haven't had as many adverse childhood experiences. And then for affordable housing with just some support. And then for our folks who really need a longer term support that have been victims of trauma and such, need that supportive housing. So we as kind of an industry of folks who are working with this population are looking for figuring out what's the right intervention for each person. So it is definitely a more complicated challenge than, I don't want to, not to minimize the work that we've done with chronic and veterans, but with families, it's definitely a little more complicated because you're dealing with children, you're dealing with trauma.
You always did deal with families. I mean, Life Haven always dealt with families.
Yes, and we still do, but now we have a range of interventions for them. So right from eviction prevention, which we do in Bridgeport, straight through.
You have places in Bridgeport too? So
we don't have any housing in Bridgeport at the moment, but we work very closely with the Fairfield County Communities Foundation and the Bridgeport Housing Authority to provide services to folks who are at risk of eviction.
Gotcha. So they don't become homeless in the first place.
That's, if you get evicted from a housing authority, it's really hard to recover from that. And so you typically will end up doubled up as a family and then eventually either in the homeless system or the child welfare system. Because in many cases, if parents can't secure a place to live, it does put the children at risk of being taken into custody. Cruz
checked in on Facebook. Thank you for listening to, and you're listening to Dateline New Haven at WNHH FM, and we have the pleasure today talking Kellyanne Day, for the CEO of New Reach, which runs two homeless shelters, but also supportive housing, rapid rehousing, other services, eviction prevention to try to keep people from needing shelter. Now, Kellyanne, the other times you've been in, we talked about two exciting developments in Connecticut where we declared victory. We said that we ended chronic homelessness. And yet what did that mean? Because I always see people on the green. I see people homeless. So what did that mean we ended it if we're still seeing homeless people?
Yeah. So the definition that we use for ending chronic homelessness is that we have, that homelessness is a brief, rare, and non-reoccurring event. And that the chronic homeless individuals, which again is a specific population that are suffering from a mental health or substance use disorder, or veterans, that we have a unit to match them to. We have some place.
An apartment?
We have some place for them to live, whether it's an apartment or a room or someplace, for them to go, so that we're able to identify that person's needs and help them move into an apartment. Now,
so when we see homeless people,
work.
From the single homeless people, we're seeing people who are not chronically homeless?
And
actually, not everyone's homeless. The people seeing the green, don't they live like at Liberty?
Correct. Correct.
On State Street.
It's interesting, Paul. Like the folks who hang out on the green, it's they're not always homeless.
Right, they're coming from methadone clinic from out of town.
Yeah. I mean, they it's not always the folks who are homeless, and actually, when you look at the numbers and you look at who the face of homelessness is in the state of Connecticut, it's really families and youth.
But youth
it's just that you don't see them.
Okay.
They're not hanging on the green, right? They're not there. They're doubled up. We had a family that was living under the bridge with a 4-month-old that came in around Christmas time.
Yeah, I remember you telling me about that.
Yeah, we just reunited a mom with 2 kids who was homeless, and DCF had taken the children because she had no place to go, and so we were able to, and we do this work, Paul. New Reach does this work, but we don't do it alone. We do it in partnership with the other providers here in New Haven. So Columbus House. Liberty, Christian Community Action, Spooner House, and Bethel.
And I remember when, this has been a couple of years now, when you ran this first to wipe out chronic homelessness, then veterans homelessness. That was all about having all your agencies working together, that you each take a day where you're the intake agencies. People who are homeless are going to go to one place each day in the week, and then you're going to communicate with all the other shelters to see which is the best place for them to go and what programs to enlist them in, and that you're going to have one central database. Has that been working out?
It has. It has. And we've got some statistics. People can actually look on the Coalition to End Homelessness website, and they can track some of these numbers in terms of how many people are flowing into what we call our CAN, our Coordinated Access Network, and how many people are getting matched to housing. And then just to make a distinction, when someone is matched to housing doesn't necessarily mean they're housed yet. It means that we've found them a subsidy, but we may still be looking for an actual unit for them to be matched to.
When you talk about the shift now, the real face of homelessness in New Haven is families and youth up to 18, 24. Do you have any numbers on that?
I do have some numbers. The active number of families that are homeless in the state is about 250 as of this week.
In the whole state?
In the whole state, with an additional about 60 that are active youth families.
Is that in the 250 number?
No.
So what does an active youth family mean?
It means they are in a shelter. So folks who are on what we call the by name list have been taken through that intake process, as you talked about, the CAN process, and they have been identified as being homeless and they've been sheltered. So when we look at those numbers, they don't include children. So I think 240, times about 2.5 children.
240 or 250?
250.
Okay.
And then you add children to that. That could be a staggering number. And then you add the number who are on our wait list for some sort of housing intervention that may not necessarily, Paul, be literally homeless on the street, but they are coming to us saying they need shelter. For whatever reason, if they're doubled up, it may be an unsafe doubled up. It may be that it's putting their children in danger. It may be that it's time limited. It may be, yes, you can stay here until Friday, but then you need to get out because you're putting my housing at risk with my landlord. So it's a very interesting. So Matthew Desmond wrote an awesome book called Evicted, where he did a study. I don't know if you heard of it.
Massachusetts, right?
Excuse me?
Was he from Massachusetts?
He did. It was in Chicago.
Oh, okay.
He may be from Massachusetts, but the book was
Right,
studied Chicago.
A modern classic, yeah.
Right. And it's just interesting how many stops families make before they actually land at the shelter door. It's typically about 4 stops.
Friends and family to house them.
And you think about those children. Think about the trauma that those children are experiencing, and the moms when you're not sure where to go and you're not sure if it's a safe place for you or your child.
Let me just get you on one more statistic. You said plus 60 active youth families. What?
Right.
That means the 18 to 24. But why aren't they in the general family category? What makes them different?
We're trying to break them out just so we can see.
So it's 250
what the need
families
is there.
where the adult is above 24.
Correct.
And then another 60 families with an adult, and all those 60 youth families include children of children, or no?
They include head of household youth that have their own children.
Okay,
so these are 18 to 24-year-olds who have children with them.
So we're talking 310 then. And do we know how many are in New Haven?
So in New Haven, we have the by name. Let me just look here. Youth. We have about 80 youth that are non-families. In family youth, we have about 10 that are active right now in the shelter system, and for families, we have about 43. These are some numbers from last week that we have that the state pulls for us. But I always want to put the caveat that that's the number that we can shelter. That's not necessarily the number
who are homeless,
who are in need of the shelter. So there's a distinction between, if you are literally homeless and you're a family, we are working together as a CAN to make sure that you are housed that night, whether or not you get priority for the open unit if one of the shelters, if Life Haven has an opening or Christian Community Action or Spooner, we work together to get that literally homeless family housed that night. If we don't have an opportunity, we'll actually look at some funding that through partnerships with the United Way and the City of New Haven to be able to motel people for a short period of time until we can get them into housing.
The first time I've ever heard that as a verb. Motel people.
Motel people.
Transitive verb.
Unfortunately, it's something that happens. So, but the folks who are not literally homeless tonight are still, they're in that category of folks who are moving around, right? Those 4 stops in 18 months before they actually get to the shelter door. And so for us, it's not just about moving folks out of shelter. It's about safely moving folks out to a stable housing environment so that they can stabilize their family. So, so we know that the folks who are on the wait list, I think there's about 40 people on the wait list right now who are working with our diversion staff to try to be diverted from shelter. And again, so these are probably people who are doubled up or some of them may be places that are somewhat safe, but maybe time limited. They can't stay there for very long, or they may be some places that are unsafe. And so we're working to prioritize them to get into the shelter. But the literally homeless families are priority for the next shelter. And we have seen, I was talking with Carmen Brown, who runs our shelter program yesterday, and she said, we're seeing about 1 or 2 literally homeless families a month for the past couple of months coming in, it's an increase, which makes sense since we closed down 10 units. We've also closed down, Christian Community Action closed down their transitional housing.
At 660 Winchester?
For families.
Oh, what are they doing with that building now?
I'm not sure what they're doing. We'll have to ask Benita that.
But why did they close
bring
it
Benita
down?
on and ask her what she's doing.
She's coming on next week. What are they doing with the building now? You don't know?
I'm not sure what they're doing with the building. I know she had some plans for it. It's a great big building.
School.
Yeah. So hopefully she'll be able to get some funding to repurpose that.
So Kellyanne, you say you've been doing this a long time. How long have you been doing this work?
I've been doing this for 21 years.
At the same place?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
And so you noticed the changes. You talked about the focus, the rise of the home of families and youth families as the face of homelessness. How have you seen your agency and other agencies deal with that shift? Have there been debates about how to address it, about how to prioritize getting someone out the door that night versus getting them into a stable situation? Have you seen an evolution in strategy?
Yeah, this has been an evolving field. So 21 years ago, we didn't have programs called rapid rehousing or diversion. Or even supportive housing for that matter. And so it's been very exciting to watch and be part of the growth of these interventions, both on a statewide level. And Connecticut's been a leader in many of these interventions nationally, but other areas are working on it too. But there can be this feeling of which population do we prioritize, right? And so when there are limited resources, it can get difficult to decide which population to prioritize when every population is in need. And when there are limited resources, I think we're really trying as providers within Connecticut and New Haven to really focus in on what the impact and the outcomes are of each of these interventions that we've created, and really be able to make sure that we have enough spots in each intervention for those that need it. And I think that's still evolving, and we're blessed with really smart people and very committed and passionate people who want to do this work. So,
and now what's the relationship with the provider community and City Hall? So the city spends about $1 million a year in the community, $1.5 million supporting homelessness efforts.
I think it's $1 million. I think it's $1 million, a little over $1 million.
And a few years ago, they've got changed now in who the top social service administrator is. Martha Okafor is no longer there. She oversaw a rethinking of strategy. I know it ruffled some feathers. She said we got to spend our dollars more toward having strategies for long-term solutions to homelessness rather than just getting people out of shelters.
Right.
How did that play out and what's happening now? What's the relationship with the city?
Well, I'm not sure how that's playing out because I know some of that money was redirected to other organizations that were going to do some drop-in centers and some youth shelters, and I don't know that has actually come to fruition yet. So it would be really interesting to have them come in and talk a little bit about what they see as
you get funding
their
from the
commitment.
City?
We get about $200,000.
Oh, so you get a fifth of that pie.
Yeah.
And what's that for?
That's
for the shelter?
operations for our
Right.
shelter. We operate 365 days a year, 24/7. When
you
it
tell me a story
snows,
about
we
someone
have
who
to
came in?
plow.
Can you
Excuse
tell
me?
me a story about a family that came in this week and how they ended up there? What you're going to do to help them?
I can tell you this is an interesting story. Is that and it kind of brings together how we're trying to track and use data, but also still be compassionate and focused on people. There was a woman who was on our by name list who was on the single by name list. So she was on the individual list, not the family list. And through the work of the collaborative, through all the organizations working together, this was discovered that the only reason she was on that individual list is because her children had been taken away because she had no place to live. So
Oh my, what a catch-22.
we were able to reunite her with her 4-year-old and move them over into Life Haven. And now they're on the road to some sort of sustainability and plan.
What's the next step? What is the plan?
So the next step for a family coming into the shelter, typically we allow folks to get settled for about 2 weeks and see, in some cases, there is a percentage of people who resolve their own homelessness within 2 weeks, and then there's another group of folks who we then assess and say, okay, are you a candidate for rapid rehousing? Do you need a little bit of help or do you need a lot of support? And so that's where we're somehow trying to figure out how to balance resources with need. So there's a lack of supportive housing for families. All those slots are full. So when folks that get identified as needing supportive housing, they sit on wait lists and it's really hard to get them out of the shelter. Rapid rehousing, we are definitely having success moving folks out with rapid rehousing.
How does that work?
So that is, that's an old, well, it's not that old, but it started with the American Recovery Act where federal government pushed out money to help divert people from shelter and or rapidly rehouse them from shelter. So basically it's a quick fix in terms of who needs a security deposit, a housing subsidy for a couple of months, and some light touch case services to stabilize. So it could be families who experienced a period of unemployment, or someone who was sick, or a child who was having problems. And so as a result, they lost their job. So they may need a couple of months, 3 to 6 months of some housing subsidies, help finding an apartment, and then some help finding job or actually increasing their job, getting a better job. So those are the services that we provide with rapid rehousing. So we've been very successful in rapidly rehousing families and helping them to get stabilized in the community. Our concern is how can they stay stable, and we are definitely on the side of providing services to families so that families don't boomerang back into shelter. I can tell you a story of one of our families who recently won an award from the state, an advocacy award. Her name is Faith. And when she came to us, she was homeless with her toddler son. And we were able to house them in a supportive housing project. She suffered with some chronic illnesses and some disabilities. Her husband did as well. And in the 15 years they've been in our program, she's struggled with chronic health issues, including cancer, the death of her husband. But her son just graduated from high school and is on his way to college.
Really? We don't think about that.
We don't think about
how what it takes to get
we
there.
don't think about how much that saves our system.
Yeah.
We always talk about these expensive systems. So statistically, this boy was more likely to drop out of school, enter the criminal justice system, right? Just given his adverse childhood experiences by being homeless for such a long period of time. I think he was homeless for 2 or 3 years. So, this is a real success story. And so I think if you were to look at how much it cost us to have her stably housed with her son for 15 years versus how much it will have probably saved, it's hard to calculate, that number. But I think on a human basis, that's a win. That's money well spent, in my opinion.
I very much agree. You listen to Kellyanne Day from New Reach, talking about homelessness and the pivot right now. And we got just a few minutes left here. Kellyanne, when you go home at the end of the day, are you feeling inspired or are you feeling overwhelmed by the challenge that you're facing?
Depends on the day, Paul. I love to go over to the shelter and talk to the women and go to our housing programs and talk with our staff that are working those success stories fill my well. You know, we have a young woman living in one of our buildings who's a youth who was homeless, who has graduated from college, and she's applying to Yale Law School, and she's working at a law firm. And,
Wow.
you know, when I meet her in the hallway and I talk to her, I go home inspired. I go home and say, I got a great job. This is the best job. When I hear about cuts in funding and I hear about, you know, who are we going to focus, what population we're going to focus on, and is there enough resources for the families, I go home weary. I go home, sad.
So how's it looking like at state level? There have been a lot of social service cutbacks in the state. Have you had state funding cut?
We've had some small state funding. I have to say it hasn't been as bad as some of the other sectors. But I'm not optimistic for the next year.
So what's your strategy to keep New Reach on a solid financial footing in the years
That's a good
ahead?
question. We're just starting to work with, if we get the grant funding, a strategist out of Seattle who's going to help us put together a 5-year plan that includes how to make sure that we are effectively communicating with the public sector to let them know how important these services are and the impact of these services, because I think the public sector is going to have to go deep rather than wide at some point. We're going to look at our fund development. So we privately fundraise over $1 million a year to keep the doors open.
Out of how much budget?
Out of a $6 million budget.
So $5 million is foundation and government?
Public, yes. Mm-hmm. And so a small part of that is generated from our housing that we've developed. And so we're going to be looking at developing more housing and to look at other ways of having folks invest in our organization and our mission. Because I think that, again, philanthropy is not going to bail us out of these potential public dollar cuts that are coming. I mean, when we look at the city of New Haven's cuts, I mean, there's that $1 million in there, and we're very thankful for that. But we understand that's always at risk every year, and the state with the budget next year being at risk, we're just kind of treading water, but we're trying to plan ahead and say, okay, what's the most important program that has the biggest impact that we need to advocate for? So again, we've closed programs. We closed our children's program. Thankfully, YHAP and LEAP jumped in and started helping out and volunteering over there. We closed our food program. We have to look at where our money is being invested that we're getting the biggest return.
How can our listeners help?
Well, they could donate.
How would they find that? Go to
They
New
can find
Reach?
us at on newreach.org. We're on Instagram, New Reach CT. We're on Facebook. They could call us.
Right.
We're just, what's been really interesting, Paul, is that we've had a real increase in what we call third-party events. So folks in the community that care, that have gotten together, that have done, small fundraisers even, that generate maybe $7,000 or $8,000. But it's been really wonderful, and we're really thankful for all of our donors.
All right. Well, I'm thankful to you, Kelly and Dave, for what you do every day.
Thank you, Paul.
As the head of New Reach, helping to keep people housed when they're homeless and have a long-term plan not to return to the streets or under the bridges.
Right.
And thanks to Yale New Haven Hospital for providing support for today's program. We're going to take it out with the Afro-Semitic Experience, performing I Wish I Knew How It Would Feel to Be Free from the group CD, A Plea for Peace. Now we know what it's like to be free. We just got to remember to book our flight. Fly free with us all day and all night long at WNHH, New Haven's home for community radio.